Welcome. Thank you for joining me. Today we're talking about dealing with student and peer feedback because I know this is an area of anxiety, and it certainly is something that I understand. And this year it may be even more anxiety provoking than usual because we feel kind of off our games in teaching. So I love this Wonder Woman image because when I think about absorbing and responding to feedback, I like to think of myself in a position of strength. Like I am tough. I can deal with feedback. I can absorb the good stuff, and I can think about the constructive and negative things and decide what to use and what not to use. So feeling strong is a good position to be able to respond to student and peer feedback. So before we get too far in, and for those of you that I haven't met, I'm Kristen Coyle. I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and I'm a clinical psychologist as well. That's my field. So before we get too far in, this meerkat here is here to remind us to breathe a little bit because this is a good topic to kind of talk about breathing to start with. So let's start with breathing. You'll humor me for a few seconds. What I'd like you to do is to take 5 slow breaths in and 5 slow breaths out. Obviously not in that order. So breathe in, 1, 2, 3. Breathe out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 4 more times. Okay, thank you. So several times I might just mention, when you're thinking about this, just breathe. And I mean literally, slow down, take some deep breaths, let them out slowly. So I'm going to start with a story. When I was a beginning graduate student, I had the pleasure of teaching an intro psych class. And at the institution that I went to at the University of Montana, they had an excellent structure for working people into a teaching role where I had primary responsibility for a class of about 70 students, but some support behind the scenes. And one of the semesters, I came into my office, my shared office as a grad student, and taped to the door was one of my student evaluations. And on it in big letters, it said, Kristen doesn't give a rat's ass about her students. And then it went on to give like 6 different examples illustrating how terrible I was. And the person who had taped it, this was an actual student evaluation. The person who had taped it to my door was a wonderful social psychologist named Fran Hill, who supervised the intro psych grad students. And the reason she had taped it to my door was because she thought it was funny. I didn't think it was funny. It's still in some of my first semesters of teaching, I was devastated, of course. But she had an important lesson to teach me. And one was that we didn't need to be ashamed about our student evaluations, that people get hurtful comments periodically. And that is just the way an evaluative process, particularly with anonymous feedback, sometimes works. And another thing she was trying to do was to desensitize me to kind of the emotional distress that you feel when you get negative feedback like that. Of course, I thought this student was completely off the mark, and I knew exactly who it was because he had written down all these examples and they only applied to him. Like I asked her to put everything important in the first 10 minutes of class because I had to leave, and she said she couldn't do it. I was like, ha ha ha, I know who you are. But I thought this was a great learning experience. She really was really a brilliant woman. So today we're going to be talking about feedback. And just as a note about terminology, We could call it student evaluations and peer evaluations or student assessments. I like to call it feedback because you get feedback from multiple sources and you can decide what to use and what not to use. I think calling something a student evaluation or peer evaluation gives it a kind of level of seriousness that in some cases it deserves and in some cases it doesn't deserve. So we're just going to call it feedback for the purpose of this session. So we're going to be talking about student feedback, kind of pros and cons and how to approach it, and peer feedback, pros and cons and how. Now we'll start with the pros and cons because if we understand what the use is of that feedback, then we know what pieces are important to keep and pay attention to and what pieces might be more useful to just let go. So what about student feedback? What's it good for? Well, the primary purpose is it's the best indication of the student's impression of their own experience in the class. If you want to ask a student, how did you feel about the class? What was your experience? Asking them is the best way to get that information. You can extrapolate it from other things, but if you just ask them, that's the best way to know. So it really is the best indication of the student's experience. It is related to student learning. And student feedback is typically more reliable when they're providing feedback on behaviorally specific items rather than global items. So if you ask something like, does the instructor provide feedback on assignments in a reasonable amount of time? You're more likely to get kind of reliable and useful responses there than is this person a great instructor? That kind of global item, students are not as good at evaluating. We all know, and we're about to talk about what some of the biases are, but an advantage of student feedback is that the biases now are fairly well understood. And in any kind of assessment data, there's always bias, but it's more dangerous when you don't know what the biases are than when you do know what the biases are. So what are the flaws? The biases are the primary flaw. There are multiple biases that are well documented in the literature that affect overall ratings. For example, there are biases related to gender, race and ethnicity, discipline, required course versus not required. Essentially, as a very overarching statement, a woman teaching a required math course, particularly if she is a racial or ethnic minority, is going to get hit on basically all of those global biases. But there are also biases in terms of what is rewarded. So not just on the global ratings, but also on these kind of subtle effects on how it affects the ratings. So perceived disciplinary knowledge is more rewarded for men, whereas an attitude of support and caring is more rewarded for women. Which also means that if a woman is coming across as kind of being a tough but fair instructor, she's more likely to get dinged for that, whereas a man is more likely to be rewarded for that in the ratings. Another downside of student feedback is that people are not highly skilled, not just students, just people. People are not highly skilled at evaluating their own knowledge and learning process. So they may not reward more effective teaching strategies. If you've gotten feedback from students that says, why doesn't she just tell us what we need to know? We have to teach ourselves. That's an illustration of that. If you're using active learning in the classroom, sometimes flipped approaches, sometimes problem-based learning, those kinds of approaches, that there's documentation left and right that shows it's more effective for your student learning. Students may not perceive it as more effective for their student learning because they're not good at evaluating that, and it requires more effort on their part. So they may not reward it in student evaluations. It's not uncommon, for example, for people who are trying new, more effective teaching techniques to see their student evaluations drop at least the first semester, if not for a bit longer when they try it. And we all know students are not in a position to evaluate the material taught in the course. You could teach them really old or wrong stuff, and they probably would not know. So student feedback is not a good use for determining whether you're teaching good stuff. And the last one, we know there are issues with representativeness and response bias with different types of administrative techniques. So if you give a hard copy student evaluation at the end of semester in a face-to-face class, you're not going to get the students. Let's just imagine a faculty member has run off a lot of students, which we're just imagining. You're not going to capture those students if you give an in-class face-to-face teaching evaluation at the end of the semester. You may be missing a chunk of students who had a terrible experience. Alternatively, if you give an online evaluation at the end of the semester, you may capture those students, but the overall response rate may be much lower, and you may be more likely to get disgruntled and highly motivated students. So there are different skewed issues with response bias with different administrative techniques. And we're going to talk about how to respond to student feedback, but before I do that, here are some truisms that everybody knows. And I know you know them, but I just want to say them so that we're all clear that we all know them. First, there are always a few students who flip the Likert scale. They may love you and they give you all the lowest ratings possible because they have just flipped the scale. It drives you crazy, but I know it happens. Everybody gets some great comments about how you have walked on water throughout the whole semester. Everybody gets some terrible comments. Some people get some truly terrible, hurtful, racist, abusive comments, not just a few people. Not everybody, but a chunk of people. That's one reason they're so difficult to read. And your colleagues know all of these things. So when you say, oh my gosh, my average has been thrown because I had a low response rate and someone flipped the Likert scale, you're not the first person this has happened to, and your colleagues are going to believe you that this happened because this is like a normal thing. So what about receiving this student feedback? There are ways to help you receive the feedback before the semester starts. So one is look at the student evaluation questions. If you don't know what your department is asking, if you've just never really looked hard, or if you're in a new department, look at the student evaluation questions because particularly at SUNY Oswego, where we use different items and administration techniques in every department or by school, depending on the school or department. Sometimes they illustrate what the department values. So it's good to know what your peers value in the department. And sometimes there might be some surprises, like, is there a question about whether or not you accomplish the objectives of the course? Is there? Do you know? Did you explain to your students what the objectives of the course were? If you didn't, and it's on the evaluation, you may get a negative surprise. It's just good to know what the evaluation is. It's not to teach to the evaluation, it's to be aware. If you're using a particular instructional strategy that may be unfamiliar to students, talk with them during the semester about why you're doing that and why it works more than once, because they're not going to listen to you the first time around. You know what I'm talking about. So if you're using a flipped classroom technique, or if you're using a problem-based learning technique, explain the rationale about why this is a good thing. For one thing, it might help them learn better in classes in the future and understand their own learning better, but it also shows that you've really thought about your teaching and that they should trust you and come along with you, that you're going to help them learn. Once it gets closer to evaluation period, talk with your students about how you take their feedback seriously and make sure that's clear during the semester and really mean it. If your students say, even on a tiny basis, we can't hear you, we don't understand what's going on here, take that feedback, then you respond. You talk louder and you explain it more. If you're talking about midterm or final evaluations, be serious. What you write on your evaluations, I really do read them. I really do value your feedback, and I really do make changes for the next semester, because then you're more likely to get valuable feedback. If you use a mid-semester evaluation, that's a good opportunity to do that. It's also a good opportunity to go back to them and show that you meant it. Like, this is the feedback that you provided. This is how I'm going to respond. It's also a nice opportunity in some of the classes that I have taught, particularly when I do team-based learning. I often get about half the class saying, we want you to do more of X, and the other half of the class saying, we want you to do less of X. And I share that with the class and talk about why we seem to have hit a sweet spot and we're going to do the same amount of X. And then prior to the final student feedback period, talk with them again about how you really appreciate and take their feedback seriously. And there is some evidence to say that if you talk with them about the evidence that student evaluations are prone to bias, it can sensitize them to the bias and reduce the bias. One way to do that, for example, might be to say something like, women tend to be more evaluated on their personality and their appearance. I would really appreciate suggestions on the evaluation about specifically what I could do to improve the content and instruction of the class. Okay, you're welcome to jump in with questions at any time, by the way. Okay, so let's say you've got your student evaluations now. You've got them. I say in hand, but I mean on computer. Don't read them until you're ready. Read them when you're feeling strong, when you're feeling emotionally strong. If you're having a bad day, don't read them that day. Pick another day. Breathe while you're reading and have a process. The process that I use for my own evaluations, I look at the quantitative items first and the summary, then I read the comments, I make a few notes, anything that strikes me right at the moment. Pulling aside a few of the really positive comments, because I need those for emotional support. Then once I've read all the comments, including the constructive ones, then if I'm feeling a little shaky, I'll go back and read the really positive ones again. The reason is that we have a cognitive bias towards negative feedback. There are evolutionary explanations for us that we're more likely to attend to risks in our environment to keep us safe, which means that when you get positive and negative feedback, you're much more likely to remember and tune to the negative feedback and less likely to even recall the positive feedback that you received. It's a well-known cognitive bias. It doesn't mean you're weak or that you have a weak ego or self-esteem. It's the way your brain works. So I know that when I read evaluations, sometimes I have to go back and refresh the positive ones so that I have a more balanced view of what I've just seen. Now, don't read too much into them. You remember, what are student evaluations good for? What are they not good for? If you have a couple negative comments and your numerical ratings are generally positive, woo, take it as a win. Yay. One or two students with a critical comment is not a trend, and you can't please everyone all the time. Even if it's personal, don't take it personally. Your students, they don't know you. They only know you as their view of their instructor. They have their own problems, their own biases, their own relationship with the university that you represent. I'm sure you had some of those comments in the spring that were a reaction to the pandemic, that they took out on you because you had to restructure your teaching. It's not about you. Let it go. And then you want to look for trends or red flags on the quantitative items. Don't forget to look for positive trends, and look for trends or red flags on the comments, including positive trends. Small variations in the quantitative items are not reliable. Don't worry about that. If you have dropped 0.1 from a previous semester, whatever. Variation is unreliable. But if you have several students with the same comment, you might want to pay attention to that theme, particularly if they're making a procedural comment, like, this person wasn't available to me, and you have several people saying that. You might want to pay attention to that and make a note. And by the way, this list is inspired by an article by David Perlmutter that he published in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. I didn't put the reference on it, but just to give him his due. So let's have an example here. Okay, you've got 6 students that tell you that the class is too hard in your comments, plus one who is really mean and writes, Kristen is the worst teacher I've ever had. I'm passing this class because I worked my ass off, not because she taught anything to us. No one should have to take her. Bleh. Okay, so what do we do? What can you do to handle the emotional impact? What's your chair going to think? Let's start with those 2 questions. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. What can you do to handle the emotional impact and your fears about what your chair is going to think about this comment? You're welcome to chat or speak up, by the way, either way. Yes, Elizabeth, reread your positive comments. Excellent suggestion. What else?
I think what I would do is I would talk with my mentor in the department. My name's Juliet, and that's someone who isn't the chair. And usually that person has a lot more experience than I do, and they're very insightful, and they can usually explain why this could be happening. And they may be able to reframe the comment, like it said, she's too hard, I worked my ass off. They will point out to me that, hey, that's a good thing, and be able to flip it. So that's what I would do. I would go to the mentor in the department.
Excellent. Social support is a very nice aspect. I had one of these days we will have lots of lunches together again. I had experienced faculty that I had lunch with many times as a new faculty member, and this is exactly the kind of thing I would bring. It's like, this person said this horrible thing. And they'd be like, I know. Let's look at that. Aha. Julie says, how many students in the class and what percentage of the class gives negative feedback? That's a really good question that I did not include in the case. 6 students out of 8 is a really big difference than 6 students out of 150. So the next 2 questions, oh, by the way, oh no, what's your chair gonna think? How would you respond to that, by the way? You can remind yourself of the truisms, right? Everybody gets hateful comments. The longer you teach and the more students you teach, you're going to know this is right. No matter how awesome you are, somebody's going to hate you one of these days if they haven't already. Just the way it is. And any experienced chair knows that. So the next 2 questions were about like processing. How can you figure out whether you really are too hard? And assuming that if that holds water, if you really are too hard, what might you do to respond to that feedback? How can you figure out whether you really are too hard? One way to start thinking about it is to think about what's the ratio of positive to negative comments, like Julie said. Karen has a good suggestion. Wait a few days, just let it sit. Wait a few days and then go back and look at it. How can you figure out if you really are too hard? What do you think? Carolina, go ahead.
Now also with the level of the class, because if you are too hard, then your grades are, you know, with an average of C plus or B minus or something, that's one thing. But if they say you are too hard, then the average is D, that's another thing. So sometimes when new professors come in, the new faculty, they have to adjust to the level of our students. Perhaps they come from somewhere else and they expect our students to be like graduate students, but they are not graduate students. So then you kind of need to adjust the level and to kind of meet your students' needs and help them grow from there.
Right, right. I think that's an excellent point. Social support is great here too. We're talking to colleagues. What are your expectations for students at this level? If you're teaching a freshman class, what do you expect them to know when they come in? How many hours are you thinking they're going to spend on this per week? You can talk with faculty that you continue to consider to be really skilled in teaching, even if it's not in your discipline. Like you can talk to John and Rebecca, for example, and say, here's this feedback I got. How do I evaluate this? Is this worth taking a look at? There's some great comments in the chat as well. Review the class content and think about the course level and the requirements and the prerequisites. Should students have gotten something as a prerequisite, or is this a first thing in this track? Ask your chair how your class grades compare to others. From Julie, getting your students to teach themselves through working problems, can be a positive. Yes, Kate, absolutely. And sometimes they consider that to be working really, really hard. But if you have 6 students out of not a giant class saying, I'm working too hard, it's worth thinking about. What might that mean to them? Is that number of hours a week? Is that the level of support that you provided through scaffolding? Is that you think they have prerequisite knowledge that they don't? Thinking through and seeing if there are strategies that match for where you think the issue might be. Oh, and Elizabeth says, asking them during class, because if you're doing formative evaluation class like let's say you do a midterm student feedback and you get that feedback. That gives you an opportunity to actually talk to them. What could this mean? How can we rephrase? How can we make some adjustments for the rest of the semester? And then John says, share assessment activities with trusted colleagues for feedback. Excellent, excellent. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, my second story. So I told you I'm a clinical psychologist, and as part of clinical psych training, we do a lot of supervised psychotherapy. So for years, I had clients, and every week I would bring my videotapes to my supervisor. And this was in the 90s, so we had a cart that looked very much like that. I would bring my videotapes to my supervisor. We would watch live video of the psychotherapy sessions. We would talk about my approach with my clients. I would get feedback every week for years. And I worked with the same supervisor just coincidentally for quite a while. And after I'd been working with her, not very long, a few months, she said, you know, every time I give you a suggestion, you tell me that you've already thought about it, that you already thought about that. And what I was responding to was, I was very afraid of the evaluative nature of this feedback. And I wanted to show that I was on top of things. And I had thought through a lot of stuff, but the way that I was telling it to her made it seem like I was closed to her feedback, that I didn't want to consider what she had to say. So I had to retrain myself that when she had feedback for me, I had to stop and think about it. I couldn't say, I already thought about that. I already tried that. This doesn't work. I had to stop and think about it and consider about what she had to add, even if it had been something I had thought about or tried. What does this add to my skill in psychotherapy? So now we're talking about peer feedback. So what's it good for? It's really good. The whole peer feedback structure is very good for creating dialogue around teaching between peers and sharing practices. Universities that don't have a strong peer feedback structure often never talk about teaching between their peers. They just don't talk about it because it's kind of scary to talk about what you're doing in the classroom with your peers. And if you don't have a method to do that, sometimes it just doesn't happen. So it's very good for creating a consistent dialogue about teaching. It's good for providing feedback about course content and discipline-specific teaching strategies. Who else is going to be able to tell you how to teach your discipline and whether you are teaching current methodology and current content than the peers and the discipline? It's good for sharing departmental teaching expectations in a personalized way instead of just globally, like in a meeting or in a written document, including pointed correction when that's necessary. And I say that's unusual because it is unusual when somebody is really off base and their colleague has to say, you're like heading in a totally different direction than all the rest of us. It works both ways so that junior faculty who are being observed by senior faculty sometimes are demonstrating to senior faculty new teaching practices that they may not have seen before, or faculty coming from another institution who have become skilled in a different approach. So it's also good for sharing new teaching practices. It can also be helpful for getting specific feedback. If you say, I'm really struggling with covering this basic concept that is a tricky one for students to get, what do you do about that? It's a good opportunity for getting specific feedback. And ideally, it's also good for creating a longer term teaching development relationship where you can continue to talk about your teaching together. So what are the flaws? Peer observers are not usually teaching experts. They have much expertise in many areas, but they're not generally selected because they are experts in pedagogy. The peer feedback process is also highly personalized, and it's not, because of that, it's not reliable between observers or between instructors. For those of you who do social science research using observational methods, you know that you need a rubric and you need training of observers, and then you need to determine whether the rubric can be administered reliably, and then you have to double check reliability. I mean, this is not intended to be like a research standard observational practice. It's meant to be highly personalized. And because of that, you can get wildly different feedback depending on who the observer is. It's also likely subject to bias, but the biases are less well documented than that for student feedback. So for example, there are biases of the power of the status quo, where people who are doing different things may get penalized from peer observers just because they're different. Sexism and racism, et cetera, can still be an issue in peer feedback, as we all know. And these can be exacerbated by unequal power between the observer and the instructor, because it's difficult for the instructor who's being observed to say, now, wait a minute, is that the feedback that you would give to our white colleague? Is that the feedback that you would give to our, yeah, it's difficult to call them out on that. There's also, I know many of you have experienced this, there's a little concern about it impacting peer relationships within the department. If you get an observer that you have strong disagreement with, do you want to argue that with them? Do you want, like, you're going to work together maybe for 20 years. How are you going to negotiate this small period in time to build the overall relationship? Which is my next part. So if you're preparing for feedback, remember that the feedback is taking place within the context of a professional relationship, and you should have two goals. One is that you use this experience to improve your teaching, and one is that you use this experience to build the relationship. This is not just for peer feedback. Obviously, if you work on a committee with them, this is actually also, there's also two goals for that committee work. That part of it is that you develop these strong professional relationships, and part is that you get the work done that needs to be done. So how else can you prepare? If it's a live class observation, plan to include some direct instruction, plan to include some interaction in the class. Most peer observers expect to see you be able to do both. So it's good to have a plan to be able to do both. Don't do something new. Don't be like, I've always dreamed of doing this new thing, and this is my opportunity to show that I'm comfortable with flashy new things. No, because you're going to screw it up the first time. We all screw up flashy new things the first time. Just pick another day to try that. In general, if there's a peer observation scheduled, you should always have a conversation before and always have a conversation after. And that's part of the formal process in most departments, but not all peer observers have done it a lot, and they may not know that, or they may not remember. So you can cue them because you really want to talk in advance. What's your plan for the class in general? How do you structure the whole semester? What are your learning goals? How does this period that they're observing fit within those learning goals? What are you trying to achieve for that class? What should they expect to see? Are there specific areas that you want feedback? So you're giving them the context for the course so that the feedback that they can provide you has a meaningful anchor. And then make sure you have a conversation after the observation too, because you want to make sure that whatever feedback they have for you that they should be providing in writing so that you can include it in your folder, that you have a dialogue about it so that you understand what points they're trying to make and that you can clarify anything where there are questions. Okay, so let's say you're having this post-observation conversation. How do you respond to it? First, any great observation should have constructive criticism. Expect it. If they don't have it, they are not doing their job. They're trying to help you improve. So as soon as they say something that sounds negative, remind yourself, this is supposed to happen. You keep an open mind and you're going to breathe, because in our lives, it's really very unusual for us once we move into professional positions to receive pointed feedback from peers. It's very unusual. And because of that, it can carry extra negative emotional tone. Now, in an administrative position, I have an evaluative conversation with my supervisor at least once a year, if not more often, in which my supervisor says, these things are going well. These things you should improve. What are your goals for next year, and how can we talk about them? Do you have a pointed conversation like that with someone in your life right now? Some chairs do it, most don't. Like the kind of conversation you have in responding to peer feedback where someone says, you did this well, you could improve these things. It's now so unusual in professional life that it's really scary to have. Just remind yourself that. Keep an open mind and breathe. If you're worried you're going to focus only on the negative, be ready to take notes. And as you receive positive feedback, write it down just real quick. So they may start with positive feedback. You did a really nice job opening the class and kind of setting the stage of what you were going to talk about. Setting the stage, right? So that as you receive constructive criticism, you can look at your notes real quick. There was a positive thing. I'm not bad. Not all bad. Little positive thing. Honestly, I do this when I receive feedback. So when Scott gives me my annual evaluation and we talk feedback, I write down the positive things he says because I know cognitive bias, I'm going to focus on the negative, any constructive criticism, and I'm going to forget the positive feedback because that is the way our brains are wired. If you start feeling overwhelmed or anxious or attacked, it's completely fine to say, thank you for the feedback. I'm going to take some time to think about it. I might follow up with some questions later. Because if you're feeling emotionally overwhelmed, you're probably not going to be able to ask very intelligent questions in the moment. You just say, thank you. Thank you for the feedback. I'm going to think about this. I'll get back to you. That's okay. Don't argue. It's fine to clarify, but don't argue. If they say this thing happened in class, don't say, no, it didn't. Because it comes across as very defensive. Now you can say, oh, that's interesting. That wasn't my perspective. And you can clarify what you thought happened. But arguing when you're receiving feedback makes it sound like you're not open to feedback. If you have questions, feel free to ask. You're allowed. And then it doesn't matter who your peer observer is. You are a professional person. You don't need to be only on the receiving end here. This is a dialogue you're trying to create with a peer where you develop your teaching. So feel free to ask them about their teaching so you can start this kind of teaching dialogue. How do you approach XYZ in your teaching? How do you approach this topic? What about, you noticed that my students were having private conversations unrelated to the content in class. What kinds of things do you do in class to help with that? You notice that all of my students had their cameras off, and that's really important to you that some of them turn them on. How do you handle that in class without making students feel uncomfortable or attacked? You know, creating a dialogue. This is not just about you getting feedback. You can create a relationship where then you can go back later and say, hey, I tried what you said. You know, what do you think about this? Say thank you. Being a peer observer is kind of scary too, because you're putting your own expertise on the line with someone that may be an extremely skilled teacher, and here you are having to step into essentially an expert role and provide feedback. And it can be emotionally a little bit scary too. So say thank you. It's service to you. Even if you don't like the feedback, they are providing service to you in the department. So let's try another case. A senior faculty member visited your class. Okay, we've now gone from too hard to too easy. Visited your class and gives you feedback that you are spoon feeding your students and you should expect more of them and be more rigorous. So these are the same kind of questions. Ouch, how do you handle the emotional impact and respond in the moment? And oh no, what's your chair going to think? What are the other faculty in your department going to think if they see this peer observation in your folder, etc.? What do you think? First, how do you handle it in the moment? Your senior faculty members looking at you and saying, you are spoon feeding your students. You should expect more of them. How do you handle that? All right, Juliet, very diplomatic. I appreciate your input. That wasn't my perspective. It wasn't something that I was aware of. And then you can follow up with questions, right? What gives you that impression? How might you approach it differently? In what way am I doing that? Very nice. Thank you for your observation. How would you suggest I make changes? Very nice, Elizabeth. Okay, and in this, at the same time, like a little part of your brain is maybe panicking, or a little part may be like, screw you. I know you're super mean to your students. I don't want to be mean like you. You just leave those parts and continue the conversation. You're not trying to emulate someone's teaching that you don't admire. But perhaps they saw something that you can learn from, even if it is only that some people might perceive that you are being too easy. What is it that you're doing that contributes to that perception? And how can you change that without necessarily changing the way you're approaching your students if you really disagree with that feedback? Because sometimes there can be a difference of perception, right? If you're being really nice, for example, some people who don't have as friendly a persona in the classroom may perceive it as being too easy when you're just warm. Some people don't provide a lot of scaffolding for assignments, some do. Some allow multiple drafts, some don't. But if the learning objectives are similar, then we get to the next two questions. Actually, reshare. How can you figure out how to evaluate this comment? And some of the suggestions that we talked about before are relevant here as well. Talking with peers, talking with your chair, asking for clarifying input from your observer, assuming you really are being too easy. If you want to take that to heart and make some changes, what might you do to respond to the feedback? Run your changes by your evaluator. That's a good idea. Or someone else that you trust in the department. Oh, or outside of the department. Sometimes when there's feedback like that, it's more about the level of analysis or depth that people are asking from their students. So you could ask a colleague that you trust to review assignments with you or review tests or projects with you. What kinds of things do you have your students do? You know, we've got really incredible teachers at SUNY Oswego, amazing faculty, and they have come up with some pretty creative stuff. So when you say, what do you ask your students to do who are at a similar level, you may get some really awesome ideas, whether or not you are being too easy. Now, what do you do with all this feedback? One thing that I hope all of you do, I know many of you do, is that throughout the semester, you keep notes about what you'd like to change or improve for next time, because you want to do it when it's fresh in your mind. Like, that activity went really terribly. I should do it a different way, if with hindsight the next time around. When you're receiving feedback, it's also good to make notes in the moment. This is what occurs to me now. This is what I might want to work on. If students are telling you something about their experience, believe them. If their experience was that it was too hard, believe that that was their experience. If their experience was that you weren't available to them, believe that that was their experience. Even if you think there's a bigger context, and think about how you might want to respond to that. And then explicitly include the reflection that you're doing about your feedback in your annual evaluation materials. So when we're thinking about evidence of teaching effectiveness, how do you tell if somebody is a great teacher? There are all kinds of evidences that can be used, not just one thing. Oftentimes we focus on student feedback because it is well understood, relatively easy to gather, and it's got numbers. But numbers seem so exciting. Lots of other stuff is more narrative. But all of us know that you can't tell if somebody is a great teacher based on their student feedback. You might get a hint about some things, but it's only one piece of evidence. Here are some evidences, there are additional ones. But if you are concerned about what people are going to think about your feedback, the best thing to do is for you to think about it. Think about it. What do you want to do with it? How are you going to reflect on the feedback you've received and grow from it? What are you going to try that's different? What are you going to try again that you think was good, but you did poorly and you could do it better? And put that in a narrative, because when I know that when I am reviewing annual folders, People who are really thoughtful about their teaching, they say, I tried these things. Some of them didn't work, but some did. And this is how I'm going to grow. And this is the feedback I got from students. And this is how I'm responding. And some of that is not working. And I'm going to try it again. And I tried this development and I went to these SELT sessions and I'm doing these things. That kind of reflection and growth, even if the feedback you got was negative, that's a positive reflection on you. By the way, student learning is an excellent evidence of teaching effectiveness, but it's very tricky. So we often don't use that at the institutional level, but you're free to use it at an individual level. You can say, I tried this. My students didn't do so well on the material I was teaching. I tried it differently. They did much better. That's evidence of good teaching. That at an individual level, you can evaluate and you can describe. At an institutional level, it's a lot harder, so we don't typically look at student learning as evidence of teaching effectiveness. We separate those usually. What becomes a concern, just so you know, where do we get worried? We get worried when there's a pattern of lower student evaluations, often that are combined with student complaints, not individual complaints, a pattern. And when you add that to a pattern of unavailability or unresponsiveness to students and instructor rigidity, where they won't consider feedback from their peers and students, that's a problem. None of you here have that experience, are in that situation. But if you weren't wondering, how bad do my evaluations have to be for it to become a problem? It becomes a problem when you say, everybody is wrong, I'm doing it right, I'm not going to take this feedback, I'm going to ignore it, these people don't know what they're talking about. That's a problem. But if you're taking feedback, even if some of it is fairly negative and saying, I'm going to grow from this, I'm going to do better, I believe in my students and I believe I can do this, that's okay. Last case. This is a different one. Several students have made comments in class questioning your expertise and now have put comments on their evaluation that you didn't know what you were talking about and that you were disorganized in class. One comment was, she should go back to high school wherever she came from. And here are the same kinds of stimulus questions as before. But this one has an extra layer. Let's just look at this third one. How can you figure out whether there is a foundation? What are alternative explanations? What does this sound like to you?
To me, it sounds like it's steeped in racism or sexism or something like that, an ism of some sort.
This does sound like an ism. We hire only qualified people. So if you have students consistently questioning somebody's qualifications, as long as you haven't made a horrible hiring mistake and you actually got the transcripts and everything, it's something else. It's something else. Some kind of ism. And the question I asked there, assuming you might have similar students in the future, what might you do in response to the feedback? Means that you are qualified, but how sometimes because of the culture that we are in, some people have to put their qualifications forward more forcefully than others. So as a woman instructor, when I walk into class the first day, I say, these are my qualifications. I spent this many years getting my doctorate. I did a year clinical internship. I go through all of them. I did a 2-year postdoc here. I did this here. This is my academic claim. And these are the topics that I publish on. And part of that is because I want them to know that tiny little women are highly qualified. So are super tall men. So are people of all kinds of races and ethnicities. Okay, I'm looking at Michael's comment. Michael, I'm going to read out your comment because I don't think the recording captures it, and I think it's a great comment. Sometimes students touch on critiques that exist within the discipline. So although crudely stated, quote, I think a Native American should teach this class, not you, end quote, is actually a deep question within the discipline and individual instructors must deal with personally. I think that's an excellent, excellent point. And by the way, if this is something that is showing up on your evaluations more than once or twice, please talk with your chair or talk with me about it, and we can talk about how we can help you to feel protected and supported in teaching, and make sure that you know that this kind of stuff is not going to derail you. Instead, we can support it. Oh, and not you, just Michael, not just Michael, everybody. So thank you. I appreciate your comments and your input. Hold on. I meant to copy those links, but of course I forgot. I would really appreciate your feedback. I actually really do value feedback, not just from students, but from you as well. So if you could take 2 minutes to do my feedback form, I would really appreciate it. So the feedback form is in the chat. And I also did a short version of the slides that if you wanted them, you are welcome to have them, so that that document is also there. Any final thoughts or questions? You are all welcome.
Thank you. I thought this was terrific.
Yay.
And you know, I'm already tenured, so I'm less nervous about getting it. But now I think more about them on the other side, and that's why I came today, because I wanted to provide, I wanted to be more of an expert, I guess, when I'm giving out evals. So thank you.
You are so welcome. Excellent. Good to see all of you. Have a wonderful afternoon and evening. And thank you, John and Rebecca.